This video is going to be just a quick introduction to graphs. There are so many interesting and amazing things that you can do in graph theory. So I encourage you to check out a couple of videos or a whole class like I took on graph theory. But this will just be a very quick introduction. So a graph is really just a set of vertices and edges. And vertices cannot be the empty set, which means you have to have at least one vertex for it to be a graph. But edges can be the empty set because it could be that you have vertices that are not connected. And notice the way that we write that, VE. And essentially we're saying edges are going to connect either one or two vertices, and we tend to call those endpoints. So I've drawn an example for you here, and this is just called a simple graph. It's simple because each edge connects two different vertices and no two edges connect to the same two vertices. So let me give you an example of how it would not be a simple graph. Let's say I added something that went from B to B called a loop. Going from B to B means now this is no longer a simple graph. Or if I had an additional edge connecting vertices A and D, then that would be considered not a simple graph as well. So either of those things would make it so that it's not a simple graph. Just a couple of things with terminology. There's just a lot of terminology when we're talking about graphs because it's something probably that you haven't studied before. So first let's look at a multigraph. A multigraph has multiple edges containing the same connecting the same two vertices. So here I've got an edge connecting AB, and here I have another edge connecting AB, and that's what makes this a multigraph. A loop, however, again, we talked about that a little bit. A loop connects a vertex to itself. A multigraph actually would not contain any of those loops, but a pseudograph is what I have pictured here, which contains both multiple edges and loops. So it could include one or both. We've already spoken a little bit about digraphs or directed graphs, and this is just a graph where each edge is associated with a pair of vertices. So the directed edge associated with AB begins at A and ends in B, etc. So if we were to list the vertices included in this directed graph, we would have AB because A goes to B, so I've used this one. And I would also have AC because A goes to C. And then looking at B, I've got one from B to A. So BA would be 2 points here. B to C. And then from C, I have C to B. And I also have C unto itself. So these would be the ordered pairs that would be associated with this particular directed graph. So just a quick summary. We have simple graphs, multigraphs, pseudographs, a simple directed graph, which we didn't speak about in specifics, a directed multigraph, and a mixed graph. So let's talk about what all of those things are. We know a simple graph has edges that are not directed. And does that allow for multiple edges? No, because it's simple. Can you have a loop in a simple graph? No, you can't, again, because it is simple. But if we're looking at a multigraph still has not directed, so it's non-directional. I can have multiple edges, but I still cannot have loops. So if I want this to be a yes in a non-directed graph, then it's got to be a pseudograph. I can have multiple edges and I can have loops. Again, this is not directed. So now let's talk about directed graphs. So we just sort of threw it out there, but I didn't talk about any specifics on the directed graph. So there is such a thing as a simple directed graph, which of course would be directed here for the edge type. But because it is simple, again, we would not have multiple edges or loops allowed. If I look at a directed multigraph again does have directed edges. And because it's a multigraph, yes, we can have multiple edges, and because it is directed, yes, we can also have loops on a directed multigraph. And a mixed graph essentially gives us the opportunity to have some edges that are directed and some edges that are not directed. So we can use either or. Because it is a mixed graph, we're essentially saying, you know, go to town, do you. Multiple edges allowed? Yes, they are. Loops allowed? Yes, they are. So that's sort of a quick summary of the types of graphs that we've been introduced to. We're going to spend quite a bit more time on graphs in our next lesson, so this was just a brief introduction. I did not go through all of the graph models, so your textbook does a great job of talking about some of the different ways that we can use graph theory in social networks, communication networks, information networks, software design, transportation networks, biological networks, etc. So I suggest that you take a look at some of those examples in the second half of section 10.1.